Today's shiur begins at the third line from the top of Daf Ayin Gimel. You'll notice that we have a firebox marking around Rav Sheshes, indicating that this is a central name, and the idea that will be discussed here will last for quite a while. On the side of the Gemara, we have a topic heading, and we indicate there Ad Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. In other words, we have a rather long discussion ahead of us. The issue here is Orel Mahu B'Maiser Sheni. As you're quite well aware, if you're not a first-time listener, we've been dealing since the beginning of the parak, as the parak's name indicates, with the issue of arlus, of he who is uncircumcised. In our most recent discussion, we were speaking about the orel and his relationship to truma, that the orel is prohibited from eating truma. The uncircumcised kohen is not allowed to eat truma. Here we're going to discuss the orel and his relationship to Maiser Sheni. So maybe just a word about Maiser Sheni. There is a 7-year sabbatical cycle. During the first six of the 7 years, so people engage in agriculture activity, and tithing is required. Amongst the different tithes, without getting into too much detail, is the Maiser Sheni tithe. That is the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the sabbatical cycle. 1/10 of one's produce is separated and taken to Jerusalem, where one is expected to eat the produce over there. There are many details about there's redemption and taking the money instead of the actual fruits, but that's beyond our realm right now. We're interested in the orel and his association with Maiser Sheni. Can he eat it or not? Now the Gemara. The question is one that lasts 4 lines. Ba'u minei Rav Sheshes. The question was asked of Rav Sheshes. Orel mahu b'maiser. Can an orel participate, can eat Maiser Sheni? Note the aleph, and then a few lines later there's a little bays where you see the squiggle underline expression Ol Dilma, where you give 2 sides of the question. So the first side of the question, or the first side of the analysis is Ki hechi diyolif pesach mi maiser li'inyan aninus yolif nami maiser mi pesach li'inyan arlus. So we have 2 topics. We have the topic of Pesach, the Korban Pesach, and the topic of Maiser Sheni. We know there is precedent for learning one from the other with regard to one area of halacha. The question is, just like there is an attempt to derive one from the other, can the other be used as a source for the first? We'll explain that by going over the words again. Ki hechi diolif Pesach mi Maiser. Just as we learn laws regarding the Korban Pesach from Maiser Sheni le'inyan aninus, the Maiser Sheni tithe is forbidden to be eaten by one who is an onain. An onain is someone who one of his close relatives, one of the 7 close relatives, has died and has not yet been buried. So the surviving relative is called an onain during that interim period of time. And during that time, an onain is forbidden from eating Maiser Sheni. So we also know that the laws of Korban Pesach and an onain are derived from that which we have learned by Maiser Sheni. So just as we learned the laws of Pesach from Maiser Sheni regarding aninus, Yolif Nami, maybe we should also learn in the other direction, Maiser mi Pesach. Let us learn the laws of Maiser from Pesach li'inyan arlus, namely, just like an orel is also in the Korban Pesach, he's forbidden to participate in the Korban Pesach, the orel shall also be forbidden in eating Maiser Sheni. So that's one possibility, that we will learn the laws of Maiser from Pesach. Oy Dilma, or it might be not that way, rather Chomor Mikal Yolif. I'm entitled to come to conclusions regarding a stringent area from that which is more lenient. In other words, if I find in a lenient realm of halacha, and in this case Maiser Sheni relative to the laws of Korban Pesach, we will classify Maiser Sheni as a realm of leniency. So if I find an aspect of restriction in a lenient realm, So I can argue that all the more so, that aspect of restriction will manifest itself in a more severe realm. So that's what the expression means, chomur mikal yolef. That which is more severe, like the laws of Korban Pesach, we can derive an area of restriction from what we know about a more relaxed realm, namely Meiser Sheni. And with that in mind, we were able to say that just like by Meiser Sheni, which is a more relaxed realm, a more lenient realm, and yet the onain was forbidden, all the more so, the onain will be forbidden in the realm of Pesach, which is a more severe realm to begin with. However, Kal Mechomur Lo Yolef, to derive an element of restriction from a severe restrictive realm to a more lenient realm, that's not logical. Very simply, it could be that, like in our case, an orel is restricted in the realm of Korban Pesach, being that Korban Pesach is a more restrictive area of halacha. Who is to say that same restriction should apply in a more relaxed realm of understanding, like Meiser Sheni? Therefore, Kal Mechomer Lo Yolef. And therefore I won't come to such a conclusion. I won't come to the conclusion that an orel should be osur in Meiser Sheni. So here you have it, two sides of the question. Do I derive Meiser Sheni from Pesach to prohibit the orel, or do I say no, I don't derive thusly? Omar Lahu. So now Rav Sheshes answers Tenisua. And here you'll note that we have a long answer ahead of us, and the marking indicates thusly. There are quite a few markings that appear on the side of the Gemara under our Mivneh heading. Let's take note of them. The triangle represents Nisyonos Livshoit She'elo Hanal. These are attempts to answer that very question about the orel and Meiser Sheni. Do note that this marking scheme lasts until Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. In other words, if you flip ahead, and in the context of today's shiur, as we're talking now, it's questionable as to whether we're actually going to finish all of them. We'll wait and see, because those triangles continue down Ayin Daled Amud Aleph, a number of lines where we'll number, it appears as if we have 4 attempts to answer this question. The first is over here, and the balance is found later on Daf Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. Another marking that we will be using, we'll see a diamond that's used, and we indicate under the on the side of our Gemara, the diamond is Havlota Shel Bikurim Truma Meiser Sheni. There are 3 topics that will appear in the Gemara. They are the topics of Bikurim. Bikurim is a type of tithe where the first Bikurim from the word Bechor, first, like a firstborn. This means the first fruits. One's first blossoming fruits are given every year to a Kohen. And Truma, that's the Truma tithe, also given to Kohanim, Umeiser Sheni, the topic that we're focusing on now. So those 3 examples will appear in diamonds for highlighting purposes. Kan muva hevdelim beinehem. In this section of Gemara, we will be showing the differences between them. Yesh l'tzayin shebikurim nimtza tamid bapsicha. You will notice that each time in the opening line of the source, that bikurim appears in the opening line. The other 2 will alternate in their positions. Namely, Truma will be in the first source. We'll say the obvious, and and contrasted to Truma and Bikurim, you'll see Meiser. And then the second source that's cited here, the Seifa, you'll see that Meiser and Bikurim are contrasted with Truma. So the point of contrast will change in both sources, and hopefully that by looking at the diamonds you can see that very clearly. Bikurim, though, as we mentioned, remains in the same opening position. The Gemara. We turn back now to Rav Sheshes. The question had been, what is the din of the orel regarding Meiser Sheni? Rav Sheshes says to them, Tenisuha. Here, conclude, and will spoil the suspense and tell you right away. Why not conclude that it's usher, that the Oriel is usher, and how are we going to do that? So let's read the following source. Hatruma v'abikurim chayovim alehem misa v'choymesh. The source is going to go on to list a number of aspects that Truma and Bikurim have in common with one another. Truth be told, it's not too important for us in the context of our shir to dwell on all of the details, so we'll go over them quickly. People if you are interested in more refined definitions, by all means look at the Rashi. So Truma and Bikurim are chayavim alehem misa. One, let's say a non-Kohen who eats Truma or Bikurim is punishable by death at the hands of heaven. Rashi adds misa tomei ha'oichla. We mentioned azar, but it's true also regarding, as Rashi says, tomei, someone who is defiled and eats these things is chayav misa bidei shemayim. That's as far as misa is concerned. Choymesh is the need to add a fifth, a non-Kohen, a zar, who eats the Bikurim or Truma in a state of unawareness, not aware that it's Truma or Bikurim. He discovers later on, so he has to, in addition to the principal value of the food that he ate, he has to add a fifth. Vasurim lezorim, the Truma and Bikurim are forbidden to non-Kohanim. V'hein michse kohen, they are considered the possession of a Kohen. If a Kohen were to offer the Truma fruits that he received as a tithe, or the Bikurim, and he offered them to a woman in marriage, that would work. That would clinch the marriage. That would establish the marital relation. This is not so with regard to Shitas Rabbi Meir and Meiser Sheni, that views Meiser Sheni as Momon Govoa, as something that's not really owned by you. You have a privilege to eat it, but it belongs to heaven. Hence, it's not yours to do with as you please. In other words, the possessor of Meiser Sheni cannot marry a woman with Meiser Sheni fruits. And if there is a mixture of Truma and Bikurim with common fruits, so you will need 100. You'll need 100 times, so that 100 times the Truma, so that altogether you have 101 units, 100 times of the common fruit to nullify, or as in Hebrew we say to mavatel, the presence of the Truma, so that a non-Kohen would be able to eat the mixture. If you have less than that, a non-Kohen would not be allowed to eat the mixture. This is not so with regard to Meiser Sheni, that as long as you have a majority, we say botel barov, you have a majority of non-Meiser Sheni fruit, and hence it would then lose the Meiser Sheni status, being that it's a minority. Uteunin rechitzas yodayim, before eating Truma or Bikurim, one is expected to wash his hands. This is a stringency associated with Truma and Bikurim as opposed to Meiser Sheni. Uteunin v'herav shemesh, if someone had been defiled, it's not enough for him to immerse in a mikveh, but he has to also wait for sundown. Harei elu b'Truma Bikurim mashein kein v'Meiser. All of the points we mentioned are applicable to Truma and Bikurim, and not applicable to Meiser. Ve'im Isa, if it were so that an Orel is mutter in Meiser, Nisni, it should have said this: Orel Osur Bohen, an Orel cannot participate in Truma or Bikurim, Mashen came by Meiser, as opposed to Meiser that an Orel is allowed, and it doesn't say that. So what are we to conclude? That the Orel is forbidden. And that is what we indicated when we opened up this source above the triangle. We said, let us conclude that the Orel is Osur. Osur in Meiser Sheni. The Gemara is Dochetis. The Gemara rejects this and says, Tana V'Shir. That means the Tana taught a list of elements that are applicable to Truma Bikurim as opposed to Meiser. And there are other things that could have been listed. Amongst the other things that could have been listed is the issue of Arlus, namely Truma Bikurim, the Orel is forbidden, and when it comes to Meiser, the Orel is allowed. So at this point then, we don't have an answer to the question asked of Rav Sheshes. No answer. Now, you see there's a bracketed section. The brackets are very long. This bracketed section takes you till Daf Ayin Dalid Omid Aleph. The second line from the top. And you can see there's again Toshma, an attempt to resolve the issue of Meiser, Sheni, and an Orel. If we momentarily skip over there just to get a feeling of the superstructure of this Gemara, it says there, Toshma, Nishtairu bo tzitzim hamakvin asamila. Someone was circumcised, but strips of skin that are a binding factor. In other words, without their removal, he's not considered circumcised. So tzitzin hama'akvin, the strips of skin that restrain the mitzvah of circumcision from having been completed, this person is an orel. And we dashed underline b'meiser. He does not, very simply put, an orel cannot eat meiser. My love, meiser dogon. Is it not, in fact, referring to the tithe from the produce, the fruits of meiser sheni? So very simply, orel is also in meiser sheni. That would be like Rav Sheshes wanted to conclude originally. The Gemara then will have a discussion concerning that particular source. It will reject that conclusion back and forth, and then the Gemara will eventually lead to attempt number 3. In the meantime, though, we have a very long bracketed section, as we just indicated. On the side, you see a double-starred note, Sograyim ad Reish Ayin Dal Mad Aleph. The Sograyim, the brackets last till the top of Ayin Dal Aleph, like we just demonstrated. Sham HaGemara Tamshich Lahavi Mukoros Le'inyan She'elas Orel Be'Meiser. The Gemara will resume the issue and bring sources to conclude the question of an orel and meiser sheni. B'soicha Sograyim HaGemara Tadun B'mai Shir Dahai Shir. Within the brackets, the Gemara will demonstrate that this answer is a good answer. This rejection, the Tana Vashir answer that we just gave, Reb Sheshes tried to prove that the orel should be also in meiser sheni by showing a source with information that was left out, and the fact that information was left out led Rav Sheshes to conclude that an orel, in fact, is prohibited in meiser, just like Truman Bikurim. The Gemara says you can't conclude from that source because the source was abbreviated. There are points that were left out of that source, including the orel is really mutter in meiser. In other words, the source indicated things that are prohibited only with regard to Truma Bikurim and allowed by meiser. And there's another thing that's like that, namely the issue of the orel. In order to give an answer like that and claim that the source is abbreviated, the rule throughout all of the Shas is that something else had to have been deleted from the source, leaving the source abbreviated. But if only one point is left out of a source, we will assume then that in fact it wasn't deleted and didn't belong there in the first place. So now we continue with the Gemara. My shir umay shir dahai shir. Well, what else was left out? What other point of contrast was left out to legitimatize this point of contrast as having been left out? The Gemara answers, Shir Deka Tani Seifa. There was left out that which is taught in the Seifa, that which is taught in the latter part. There's a marking that is explained under the mivneh, the structural note, you see a bow tie around the word seifa. Havlota seifa v'reisha mehem royim detona v'shir. We're going to be highlighting these expressions, seifa, and later you'll see at the bottom of Omid Beis the word reisha, that we have on our hands a source that in fact is abbreviated. So what we're going to see then is there's one Tanaic source that has an opening, a reisha, and a closing, a seifa, a second part. What we read above, where the diamonds started appearing, that was the reisha, the beginning of the source. And we claimed that information was left out of that part of the source. Is that an acceptable thing to say? Well, if you can find something else that was left out of the Tanaic source, then that's a good answer. We find something left out of that Tanaic source, but in the latter part of the source. But that's good enough. If I can show you that the entire source was in fact abbreviated by having deleted 2 points, then I'm home free. So we continue. We say, Shir, there was left out the Kotoni Seifa. The Seifa teaches, again, you'll see a list of points in which Meiser and Bikurim are together, contrasted with Truma. In the opening of the source, where we had the diamonds, Truma and Bikurim were taught as together, contrasted with Meiser. Here we have Bikurim with Meiser contrasted with Truma. So let's see, where are there points of contrast? And what are we hoping to find eventually? That there are points of contrast, but there's an additional point of contrast that wasn't stated. Yesh b'meiser u'b'bikurim ma she'ein kein b'truma. There are elements that you find in both meiser sheni and bikurim that you don't find in truma. Shameiser v'bikurim te'unin havoas mokoim. Both these kind of ties need to be brought to Yerushalayim, as opposed to truma, which is eaten wherever the kohen might dwelling. Havoas mokom. Havoas means bringing mokom to a specific place. In this case, Yerushalayim. U'te'unin vidui. There's also a special reading from psukim of the Torah that the owner must abide by, where he declares Bi'arti HaKodesh min Abayis. That's vidui, where he literally confesses or declares that he did what the Torah expects of him. So there's a formal declaration. That's vidui. Va'asurim la'oinein. Both Meiser and Bikurim are forbidden to someone who is experiencing aninus, which we mentioned before. Rabbi Shimon Matir. Now, it's very interesting to note that when the Gemara said Asurim L'onein, Rashi adds Bikurim. It's a very strange thing for Rashi to do when, first of all, you've got a plural form, they are forbidden to the Onein, and then Rashi says Bikurim. But Rashi is very, very precise. He says Bikurim when we know that Meiser Sheni is also prohibited to the Onein. The Torah itself says that he declares Lo Achalti Ba'oini Mimenu, I did not eat from it while I was Ba'oini, while I was an Oinein. So why does he add the word Bikurim? So look what happens. We go on in the source. For Rabbi Shimon Matir. What does that mean, Rabbi Shimon Matir? What does he matir? Matir means he allows. He allows bikurim to an onein. Obviously, Rabbi Shimon can't allow meiser sheni to the onein. The Torah says an onein cannot eat meiser sheni. However, regarding bikurim, you have a machloikes tanoim, and that's why when the Tanakama said asur onein, Rashi added the bikurim are also tonin as a lead-in to when Rabbi Shimon says mutter. That very point, Rabbi Shimon is matir that bikurim are mutter for an onein. What else? The chayovin bebiur. They must be destroyed, which means that though there's a period of time that you're allowed to eat the meiser and bikurim, or that, let's be more accurate, that the owner is expected to tithe them, there's a certain point in time that can be reached that if the owner didn't tithe them, so he must destroy them. That's chayovin bebiur. Rabbi Shimon Poter. Rabbi Shimon says that Bikurim are not subject to the rule of Biur. As we said before, the owner is expected to tie these things, but if a certain amount of time goes by, Rashi spells out the details, and he didn't do it, he didn't tie them, so then he must destroy that which he retained, that he kept in his possession. Reb Shimon, on the other hand, he says there is no din of biur by bikurim. So in this seifa, we see meiser and bikurim are teamed up with one another, being contrasted with truma, or if you want to say truma is contrasted with them. Ve'ilu, Aser levayer mehem betuma. That's point aleph. Point beis, we continue at the top of Omid beis. V'oichlon betumas atzmon loike. Masha'ein kein betruma lo kotani. Two additional points of contrast that you find common to Meiser and Bikurim and don't find by Truma are not stated in this source, and this source would have welcomed more points of contrast, and they weren't spelled out. So what do you have to say? Alma Tani Vashir. So you see that this source is willing to teach some points and leave out others, and hence we have justified the Gemara's rejection of Rav Shesh's answer from before by saying that by the mere fact that the source doesn't teach that Orel is Aser in Truma and Bikurim and Mutter in Meiser doesn't show that in fact is correct. So that at this point an Orel might very well be allowed to participate in Meiser Sheni. Now, we read the Gemara, but we didn't explain these points. Once again, as we said earlier, the focus is not on the details. The focus is more on the structure. But nevertheless, we read at the bottom of Amar Aleph, Ilu Osir Levar Me'em Betuma. When it comes to Bikurim and Meiser Sheni, if those elements became Tomei, so you can't burn them and benefit from the fire that comes about when you are destroying them. So again, when Meiser Sheni or Bikurim, if they became Tomei, you can't burn them and use them as fuel. This is different from the way we deal with Truma. Truma Tameya, even though you can't eat Truma Tameya, nevertheless, if you have, let's say, oil that was tied as Truma, you can use it to light a candle. You can use it as fuel. So that when it comes to, again, Meiser, Sheni, and Bikurim, if they became Tameh, you cannot benefit from their burning. In fact, the owner has to declare, Lo bi'arti mimenu b'tameh. Not so in the case of Truma. Truma that became Tameh, you can burn it. When you burn it, you can benefit from it as fuel. As we said, Truma, Tameya, oil. You can light your candles with it. Another point of contrast that was not taught in the source but could have been taught is what you see at the top line of Omid Beis, V'oichlon betumas atzmon. That means if you have Bikurim or Meiser Sheni where the owner himself is Tohor but the items became Tameh, that's V'oichlon betumas atzmon loike. Someone who eats them when they are the items, the food items, the fruit became Tameh, Meiser Sheni or Bikurim fruit is subject to lashing. Masha'ein kain betruma. Not so in the case of Truma. Now it is true that Truma that is Tameh you're not allowed to eat it, but one who does is not subject to lashing. So we see that we have a source that did not teach two additional points of contrast, indicating that the source has been abbreviated. Now, there's an interesting structure. If we see these angular brackets. Also, we have a bracket length indicator on the left-hand side of the more text. Skip the brackets momentarily. Omar Ravashi, Me Reisha Nami Shamis Mino Detana Bashir. Up till now, we demonstrated that the Tanaic source was abbreviated by skipping ahead to the end of the source, where Meiser Sheni and Bikurim were taught in contrast to Truma. What Rav Ashi says is that in the Reisha of the source, one could also see the abbreviation. Now, we mentioned that in the Reisha, where Truma and Bikurim were taught in contrast to Meiser Sheni, and as a result of this whole approach, we were saying that, well, the Reisha left out one point of information, namely that Truma and Bikurim are forbidden to the Orel, Meiser Sheni is allowed to the Orel. Rav Ashi says there's another point of information that was actually left out of the Reisha, so that we could have proven Tana V'Shir from focusing on the Reisha itself, from the first part, from the opening of the source itself. What is that? Midolo Kotani, and here the Gemara continues at the top of Ayin Dalet Amud Aleph. It did not teach the Noyagim Mishar Shnei Shvua that Truma and Bikurim are practiced all 6 years of the 7-year sabbatical cycle. The Ein Lohem Pidyon, and they are not subject to redemption. Masha Ein Kain B'Meiser. 2 points that were left out regarding Truma Bikurim versus Meiser. The Truma Bikurim, we're repeating ourselves now, are practiced all the other years. Shar Shnei. Shnei is the plural of the word Shanim, of Shana, means Shnei. Shnei Shvua, it's in the construct form, the years of the 7-year cycle, and which is not so. Meiser Sheni is only the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th years. And the other point of contrast that was not taught in the source was they don't have redemption. There's no concept of redeeming Truma or Bikurim, where there is a concept of redeeming Meiser Sheni. If a person has an abundance of fruit that comprised his 10%, and it's too much for him to take to Jerusalem, he can redeem it on cash and bring the cash to Jerusalem. So these 2 points of contrast were not taught. Shma Mino, so we conclude that the source was again Tana V'Shir, and you discover that from the Reisha itself, enabling us to tell you that it might very well be that the Orel is forbidden in Truma and Bikurim, but the Orel is allowed with regard to Meiser Sheni. Of course, we skipped quite a big section of Gemara just now in order to demonstrate that, but in the meantime, we go back to the bracketed section. You'll notice we have a starred comment on the side of the Gemara, and let's read the comment. Besoch hasograim, within these angular type brackets, Yuzbar habraisa shemuva besoif Amud Aleph v'hadiukim shel nilmodim mimenu. The Gemara will focus on the Tanaic source and inferences that can be drawn from the source that we had on Amud Aleph. After these angular brackets, the Gemara then proves, as we demonstrated already, we don't have to go over that again later. We'll read it again in Mirza Hashem, but without too much detail, as having done that now. Okay, now what are we doing? Omar Mar. We continue from the 3rd line from the top, and for all practical purposes, the issue of the Orel and Meiser Sheni, we put that aside. And that's with the marking system that we are attempting to enable you not to lose sight, though, of our focus on that point. As we said, we're now going to be looking back at the source itself. Omar Mar, here is a quote. This is a quote from the source on Amud Aleph, where we spoke about Bikurim and Meiser. From the Seifa, we saw Bikurim Meiser. We said Vasur and Le'onein. Bikurim Meiser also turning. For Reb Shimon Matir, Shimon allows an Onein with regard to Bikurim. Mino Lahu. So we ask, from where does the Tanakama know that the Onein is also in Bikurim as well? Now, as far as Meiser Sheni is concerned, we said that's a posuk. So now, how about Bikurim? Dichtiv, the pasuk says, Lo sucha lecho b'sharecha, masar degoncha v'siroshcha v'tzarecha v'choros b'korcha v'chulei utrumas yodecha. So there's a pasuk that speaks about a number of different items that one cannot eat in his own locale, but has to be in Yerushalayim. The Omar Mar, Trumas Yodecha. In this pasuk, reference was made to Trumas Yodecha. What is that? Elu Bikurim. That's not a reference to Truma. Even the word Truma appears, it's Trumas Yodecha. Now, Truma itself, we know that a Kohen can eat wherever he lives. So, Trumas Yodecha is referring to, and the Chazal know this, as referring to Bikurim. V'iskash Bikurim l'maiser. You can see in the source that Bikurim is compared to, is taught together with Maiser. And what are we therefore able to conclude? Ma Maiser also lo'inain, just like the Maiser we know explicitly is forbidden to the oinain, af Bikurim also lo'inain. So too, the Bikurim are forbidden to an oinain. So that's how the Tanakama knows an onain is also in Bikurim as well as Meiser Sheni. For Rabbi Shimon, he was matir Bikurim to an onain. What's his response? Truma karinu rachmona. The Bikurim are called by this unusual name. They're called Truma. Ma Truma muteres lo'onain. Af Bikurim muter lo'onain. By the fact that the Torah, in referring to Bikurim, used an unusual expression and called it Trumas Yodecha, it's hinting to this comparison that Bikurim are like Truma in this respect, that just like Truma is muter to an onain, so too Bikurim. That's Reb Shimon's opinion. We continue with a quote from the source on Amud Aleph, V'chayovim bebiur, namely Bikurim and Meiser are expected to be destroyed by a certain date if the owner hasn't tithed them. For Rabbi Shimon Poter, Rabbi Shimon says when it comes to Bikurim, there is no biur requirement. More makish, the Tanakama compares Bikurim to Meiser Sheni, and just like by Meiser Sheni, the pasuk says that you have to destroy them if you haven't tied them by a certain date, and Bikurim then, being that they are compared to the Meiser Sheni, Bikurim too are subject to biur. Rabbi Shimon, the lo makish, Rabbi Shimon does not compare, as we saw just before. The Osir Levair Mehen Betuma. If Bikurim or Meiser Sheni became Tomei, so you can't destroy them and benefit from their burning, from them as fuel. The Oichlon Betumas Atzmon Loike, and one who eats either Bikurim or Meiser Sheni that became Tomei, so the items are Tomei, the one who eats them when they are Tomei is subject to Malchus. And we said this, of course, is in contrast with Truma, Minolon. So how does the Tana know this information? Tisanya, we give you presented with a Tanaic source, and by the way, note that we have a long answer marking. And on the side of the Gemara, we also wrote as a topic heading, Isur lahadlik bikurim umaiser shenitmu, the prohibition of using as a fuel bikurim and meiser that became tomei. Tisanya, Rabbi Shimon Oimer, Lo bi'arti mimenu betomei. This pasuk is by Meiser Sheni. The owner declares that I did not get rid of it, the Meiser Sheni betomei, in a state of defilement. What does that mean? Bein shani tomei v'hu tahor, whether it be a situation where the person was tomei and the food, the Meiser Sheni, was tahor, bein shani tahor v'hu tomei, or that the person was tahor and the item, the food, the Meiser Sheni itself, was tomei. The Rashi, if you look across from here, a line or two down, at the end of the line, V'hochi pirusho. Let's read a few lines of Rashi. Michlal shenemar bevidui meiser, from the fact that it says in the context of the Meiser Sheni declaration, Lo bi'arti mimenu betomei. That's the pasuk we just read in the source. The mashma, it implies bein shani tomei v'chule, whether I was tomei, it was tor, or it was tomei and I was tor. Hu misvadeh, he confesses or he declares shelo biaro bo'esh, he didn't burn it in the fire, v'lo hidlik boi as haner, he didn't use it to light a candle. V'kol shekain betohor, and all the more so with regard to meiser sheni that's tohor, delo nitan elo lachilo shtia v'sicha. You can't do anything with meiser sheni that's tohor other than eat it, drink it, or smear it. Umemela shaminon, and we derive from this from the fact that he doesn't have to make any declaration regarding the meiser sheni when it was tohor. Shma mino hochi ka'omar. What we conclude is that what is being said is as follows: Afilu b'shas hatuma, even at a time that the meiser sheni was tomei, shelo yocholti le'oichloi, I couldn't eat it. Nevertheless, lo nisativ lahadloka, I didn't use it as fuel for lighting a candle. Almo eino nechal betuma. You see from here that it cannot be eaten in a state of defilement. Vehechon musar al kach. And that is what we lead into now as we go back to the Tanaic source. Where is the azhara? So we see that the man, the owner, makes a declaration, and we want to know, where does the Torah say that there is a negative command? The term azhara or muzhar indicates that the Torah issues a negative command, and when such a negative command is violated, it would lead to lashing. So the Gemara continues, Vehecha muzar al achiloso. From where do we know that there is an azhara, a negative command regarding the eating when it's defiled? Any yodea. So the response to that is, I don't know of an explicit source. Now there's a Gemara interruption. The Gemara feels that how can you say Eini Yodea to when a question like this is raised, where is there a negative command eating it in a state of defilement? Tumas Haguf, we're reading now in this bracketed section, Tumas Haguf behedyo ksiv bei, regarding the person himself who is defiled, it says explicitly, Nefesh Asher Tiga Boy V'tomo Ad Ha'orev V'lo Yochal Min HaKodoshim Kim Rochatz B'soro B'mayim. This pasuk mentions a person who had become Tomei. He is not to eat Min HaKodoshim. Min HaKodoshim is a reference to Meiser Sheni. He is not to eat from the Meiser Sheni until he achieves purification. So what was meant by the source a few lines ago when it says Eini Yodea Hachi Komebayale? The following is that which was not clear. Tumas Atzmoi Minayin. From where do we know that where the item itself is Tomei, even though the owner might be Tahar, but the item itself is Tomei, from where do we know that there is an azhara, a negative command? Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, Lo yisucha lecho b'shorecha masar degoncha. The pasuk says that you cannot eat in your own communities the meiser dogon, the meiser sheni tithe. Ulahalon hu omer. There's another pasuk that says, in the context of psulei hamukdoshim. Psulei hamukdoshim are sacrifices. They're animals that were dedicated to be a sacrifice, but they developed a blemish. So those items, those animals cannot be brought as sacrifices. What do you do with them? But they had once been sanctified. So it says, Bishorecha tochlenu hatome vator yachtov kitzvi v'chayol. Once again, you see the word bishorecha here. It says that these sacrifices that became disqualified, you are allowed to eat in your own dwellings, meaning not in the Beis Hamikdash, but in your own communities. A person who is tomei can eat it along with a person that is tor, as is characteristic of non-sanctified meat, as is characteristic of eating deer meat. Tzvi va'ayol. These are animals that aren't even fit to be sacrifices in the first place, where obviously you can have a Tomei and a Torah person eating together. V'tana debei Rabbi Shmuel, and we're taught in the following Tanaic source from the Yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, Afilu Tomei v'tor oichlim al shulchan echad b'kora achas v'einon chosheshin. When it comes to psule hamukdashim, you can have a person that's Tomei and a person that's Torah eating together on the same table from one bowl, the psule hamukdashim, and there is nothing einon chosheshin, there is nothing to worry about. The ka'ama rachmona, and the Torah is telling us, Hahu di amri lo chosam b'sharecha tochlenu, that which we said over there by the psula mikdashim, they can be eaten in your own dwellings without any regard to the problems of tumah. Hacha, here with regard to the meiser sheni, lo techol, it cannot be eaten when it is tamei. So let's take a look at Rashi to explain this particular limud, because in the Gemara itself it's not 100% clear. We need a little more elaboration. There's a Rashi which we have a star above it, Hahu, a few lines down in the Rashi, Hahu bisharecha dehasam, the bisharecha there by psula mikdashim, the kashori lei lator liochlo achar shenoga tomei bakor v'nitma. There, a person who was tahor was allowed to eat the meat that became defiled. Ko'amina lo chacha b'meiser sheni lo techol, under the same circumstances where the item where the meiser sheni became tamei, don't eat. And that's what the drush of lo tuchal lechol b'sharecha is an allusion to, and that's why the source, it's not an explicit, it's not a very explicit type we'll say warning or prohibition, but it's derived through this method of, we'll say, oral law. From this we take the pasuk of lo sucha lechol b'sharecha as an azhora, warning against eating meiser sheni that itself became tamei. And as we saw, this was contrasted with psule hamukdashim that became tamei, that you're allowed to eat. Meiser sheni that became tamei, you're not allowed to eat. Now we continue in the Gemara, having demonstrated the sources for the Isser of Lahadlik, Bikurim, and Meiser Shenitnu, as we had in our topic heading, and the Azhara for one who eats them when the items themselves became Tamei. We continue in the Gemara, Masha'en Kain B'Truma Minolan, as opposed to Truma, where one is allowed to Mavair the Truma in a state of Tuma. From where do we know that? Mevair means one can use it as fuel. Truma that became tamei, even though you're not allowed to eat it, you're allowed to use the truma that became tamei as fuel. From where do we know this? Amar Rabbi Yavo, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Di Amar Kra. The pasuk says by meiser sheni lo biarti mimenu betamei, and we infer mimenu from it, meiser sheni atam mavir. You can't burn when it became tamei and use it as fuel. Aval atam mavir shemen shel truma shenitma. But truma that became tamei, you're allowed to use as fuel. The Gemara asks, if you're already inferring from Meiser Sheni a point of contrast, V'ema, why not say like this? Mimenu iata mavir, Mimenu from the Meiser Sheni you shall not burn when it became tamei, use it as fuel. Avalata mavir shemen shel kodesh shenitma. But sanctified oil, there is in the realm of sacrifices a meal offering. Part of a meal offering is oil. Oil is used. Olive oil is used as part of a mincha. So if you have shemen shel kodesh, You have shemen, oil that was dedicated to be part of a korban mincha, but it became tamei. Maybe we're saying in the pasuk by Meiser Sheni that Meiser Sheni that became tamei you cannot use as fuel, but shemen shel kodesh that became tamei, mincha fuel, meal offering oil that became tamei, you can use as fuel. The Gemara says, no, I wouldn't say that. Lav kal v'chomer hu. Wouldn't it be through kal v'chomer that you would derive to the contrary? Uma meiser hakalom roter lo bi'arti menu b'tomei. Mind you, meiser sheni, which relatively speaking is a lenient realm. In contrast to hardcore sacrifices, meiser sheni is a more lenient realm. And yet the Torah warns against burning it when it became tamei, using it as fuel when the meiser sheni is tamei. Kodesh chamor, sacrifices including meal offerings and its component parts, ingredients, is a more stringent realm. Oh, kol shekain, all the more so it would be forbidden to use it as fuel when it becomes tamei. The Gemara says, oh, so you're concluding that shemen kodesh nitma cannot be used as fuel through this type of logic. Well, then you could have applied the same type of logic with regard to truma, namely meiser sheni, which is a more lenient realm, and yet there's the fuel restriction when it's tamei. Truma, which is a more severe, more limiting realm, all the more so using it as fuel when it becomes tamei should be forbidden. And yet we don't say that. Gemara says, well, as far as that attempt, we don't say that because haksiv mimenu, because you have the word from which we inferred to the contrary when it came to truma. In other words, it said in meiser sheni lo bi'arti mimenu b'tamei, and that was cluing us into a contrast, but something else, namely truma, I can use as fuel when it becomes tamei. The Gemara asks, Uma ro'is, what is it that you see to say that truma will allow to be used as fuel based on the mimenu inference, but shemen kodesh that became tamei we're not allowing? Answer, mistabro kodesh lo mam itna. It's more likely that which has been sanctified as a sacrifice, the mincha oil, is not excluded from the realm of prohibition, but rather it too is prohibited. Shekain, and here you have an abbreviation, and the Gemara spells out the abbreviation. Pank achas. You'll find by kodshim it has points of severity, and the points are pigul, noiser, korban, me'ilo, kores, the osul onen. We highlighted the letters in each word that correspond to the abbreviation, but these are 6 points of stringency that you find by kodshim. Pigul means it can become rendered unfit through an incorrect mindset concerning time, eating it at the wrong time, if that was in your mind when you were processing it. Nosar is if it's left over, and both pigul and nosar carry with them a kores punishment, a very severe punishment. They are korban, they are sacrifices. That's in contrast to truma, which is not a sacrifice. Me'ilah, if you misuse them, if you use them for your own personal benefit, so you're in violation of the me'ilah restriction or me'ilah punishment, which you don't find by truma. Kores, we mentioned that when it comes to kodshim, so the punishment that is due for the violation is a kores punishment, which you don't find by truma. The osur la'onein, the kodshim are prohibited to an onein, as opposed to truma, which is allowed to be eaten by an onein. So if you're going to say that something is contrasted with meiser sheni, it's not going to be kodshim. Just like meiser sheni, we said, is osur to be used as fuel when it's tamei, so kodshim as well is going to be osur. Adarabba, well, truma lo mamit no shekain machbaz. Again, an abbreviated expression, and the Gemara spells out what the letters represent. Truma should not be excluded from meiser sheni, and we should be machmir, we should be restricted by truma like meiser sheni, and not allow you to use tamei truma as fuel, because truma has its own set of unique features. Misa means misa b'dei shamayim. If it's the truma is violated, it could lead to a punishment of death at the hands of heaven. The chomesh, the need to add a fifth, a non-kohen who mistakenly eats truma will have to add, he has to pay a kohen the principal and add a fifth. The ein lo pidyon, the concept of redemption does not apply to truma, as opposed to sacrifices and meiser sheni, where we do find redemption, without getting into details now. The asura lezorim, truma is unique in that it is forbidden to non-kohanim. Not true in the case of sacrifices and meiser sheni. The Gemara says, Hanoch nefishandi, the number of restrictive points or unique points to kachim is greater. There was 6 versus 4. Another explanation of why we're not going to entertain leniency by shemen kachim shenitma kores adifa, because only by kachim and not by truma you find the kores punishment can arise, can be applied, where applied meaning heaven applies it, not so in the case of truma. The oichlon betumas atzmon loike ma she'en kein betruma, one who eats the items, not the person being tamei, but the items are tamei, whether it's bikurim or meiser sheni, that the fruit itself became tamei, and one eats them like that, he is subject to lashing. Not so in the case of truma. Milka hu deloloki, for eating truma that became tamei, he's not subject to malchus. Ha isura ika, however, there is a prohibition to eat truma that became tamei. Minolon, what is the source for that? Omar Kro, there's a pasuk with regard to psulei hamukdashim. It says bisharecha tochlenu lozeh v'lo la'acher. That means that the psulei hamukdashim that became tamei, you are allowed to eat. That's tochlenu. It is there's a limitation in that lozeh, that you can eat when it becomes tamei, for lo la'acher, but not something else. And that something else is truma. Truma becomes tamei, though you cannot eat. So you have a negative command here, but it's not an explicit negative command. It's a negative command derived from that which you stated positively, and that's called a lav. V'lav haba michlal asay equals asay. That which is of a negative command nature, but it's not explicit, but rather derived from something stated in the positive, has the status of a positive command, and that means that there is no malchus. Malchus, lashing, is given only for the violation of negative commands, not for the violation of positive commands. And this we read earlier, no need to go over it in detail, just Omer Avashi, Mereisha Nami Shamis Mina, Detana Vashir. In order to explain how an Orel would be allowed to eat Meiser Sheni in contrast to Truma and Bikurim, we had to say that the source, though it didn't teach this particular point of contrast, it could have, and the source was simply abbreviated, leaving out other points of contrast. And Rav Ashi says you don't have to go only to the Seifa in order to see this abbreviation. In the Reisha you also see this abbreviation. Midolo Kotani, from the fact that the Reisha did not teach, when teaching the contrasts where Meiser Sheni was pitted off against Truma Bikurim, it didn't teach the Noyagim Shar Shnei Shavua. Truma and Bikurim are applicable as ties all 6 of the 7 years of the sabbatical cycle, as opposed to Meiser Sheni. The Ein Lohem Pidyon, the concept of Pidyon, of redemption, doesn't apply at all to Truma nor Bikurim. Mashein Ken Ba Meiser, as opposed to Meiser. So there you have 2 more points that the source could have taught and didn't. Shma Mino. So from here we see that even in the Reisha, it was Tana, it taught points of contrast, Vashir, and left out other points. We pointed out earlier that the attempt to discover what is the din of an orel by Meiser Sheni preoccupies the coming section of Gemara, as you can see with the triangles that appear, number 2, 3, and 4, additional attempts to conclude that issue. But in the context of the Daf Yomi shiur that we have, so we've reached already the new daf, this would be a somewhat convenient place to pause.